All right, this is the 18th episode of Writer's Block. Max is missing, but we have a guest this week, so it all works out. We got DusT here. DusT, we ran into each other in Atlanta, so, you know, I obviously have to escape behind an audio-visual medium, so you don't have to witness my facial features up close. I'm doing you a great service here. Sam, how's life? You studying for exams? Okay, that's great. That's a good enough for
One of
opening segment.
You nailed it. You're really getting the hang of this.
Yeah, no, the reason, actually, like, the secret reason that Max isn't here isn't because, like, he fucked up the time or I fucked up the time. It's just, like, I was mad that I didn't get any interviews in Atlanta. I was just too fucking incompetent for that. But Max is killing it with, like, HLTV and ESPN and stuff at whatever, Malta or whatever the fuck. So I just had to cut him for the show. DusT is the new Max. I'll put the name Follow DusT under his little card, but next week you can expect just Max with Sam's face and voice. Okay. I mean, Max's. Okay. Anyway, this week we're going to do a discussion of support players. So the reason I want to start with this is actually a discussion me and DusT had between watching shit games of Counter-Strike at Atlanta. I just, like...
Okay.
This is, like... If I had to criticize my own career, which, you know, no one can really do other than me, but if I had to criticize myself, you know, the guy, what is it? Person who hasn't sinned can cast the first stone, so I can obviously cast disparity on myself. And my fucking shit just disappeared.
Go on.
Okay.
On. Keep going.
Anyway. Where am I? Yeah, anyway, I would say that my problem is I'm a bit of a contrarian. I don't think I do copy off of people no matter what fucking people on Twitter say that I just copy off of more famous people for retweets. I don't do that. But, web camera's going again. Fantastic. But, yeah, I think I'm a bit of a contrarian. And with support players, I don't know which contrarian angle to go with. Like,
yes.
Am I the sort of contrarian that thinks, like, you know, fuck these idiots who just look at HLTV 2.0 ratings. These are fucking morons, troglodytes. They can't tell. They just look at the number and tell that's how it's good. What they don't realize is there's a lot of nuance and support play, and people are playing different roles, and you have to account that. You can go that angle. Or you can go the other angle, which is fuck teamwork. Fuck all this teamwork makes the dream work bullshit. It's all a ridiculous lie to make us feel good about people who are shit at the game. Support players are dog shit. They shouldn't even exist. It's not even a term. So this is really the two angles. And I have an opinion. I have a thought. I might have a little background information that suggests that you two people on this call with me have diverging opinions on this divergent hipster / contrarian debacle. Sam, what do you think about this idea? Are support players, do you think the concept is overrated? Are you teamwork makes the dream work boring fanboy, or are you an HLTV poster who just looks at numbers?
Well, if you want to use the word support with, like, connotations of everything that they do is based on supporting, then no, like, as Zipex has pointed out, like, he doesn't like being called a support because he used to play League of Legends and he's not fucking Lulu. You know, he has the same weapons as everyone else. He has the same kit as everyone else. He's fine, like, a kit as in, you know, weapon and nade kit and grenades. And so, no, like, there is not a support in that sense. There isn't someone who plays an explicitly different function, and everyone needs to get kills and things like that, of course. But if you look at any team that I can think of, there's always going to be a divergence in the ratings. And so there's going to be the players that get a lot of resources and get a lot of frags, and players that don't. It's very rare that you get a team where a player doesn't have, or at least one or two players doesn't have below a 1.0 rating or hovers around. I think that there are certain players on the team, on most teams, where if the team is playing very well, the rating will increase, and if the team is playing poorly, their rating will decrease. Like, the most famous example of that is Zipex. Zipex right now has a very high rating, But if you look at last year around this time, he probably didn't. He was, from memory, he was at about 1.05, 1.08. Right now he's at 1.18, which is, as good as Sonny. And so part of what's going on is that because he's in positions that require a lot of teamwork and a lot of communication, when Astralis has a breakdown in communication or a breakdown in team play, he's the one that gets punished statistically more so than other players. But when they're doing well, he's fine. That doesn't mean that he shouldn't get any kills. That there is a significant difference, by the way, between someone like Sticko, who never really hovers at a 1.08, and Zipex, who does hover at a 1.08 when he's playing poorly or statistically slumping. So there's definitely divergence and room for improvement in individual skill. But I think that when we use the word support player, we're referring to players whose stats aren't reflective of their performance. They're much, in my opinion, players like Sticko and players like Zipex, their stats are much more reflective of the team's performance generally.
Okay, I had to switch out. I'm done with trying to get the webcam to work. I'm just gonna go to a static image.
Fine.
Favorite anime girl with that has a Paris theme to her design. But anyway, DusT, how would you define support player?
I mean, if I had to define a support player, first off, I would say that support isn't always like a zone that you're permanently in. I think players can kind of go in and out of a support zone depending on the map and depending on the tactic that's at hand, or depending on how the team is set up. Like, for example, a team like Liquid, who's really flexible with their roles, or a team like Made in Brazil, who basically has, people like Stewie2K and Tarek, who used to be entry fraggers, who are now kind of playing the edge of the map, or, doing things they haven't had to do before. They will kind of transfer in and out of a support zone, so to speak, depending on, like I said, what's going on in the round and what map they're playing and what specific spots they have set up for that map and all that good stuff. Whereas there are some players who kind of sit inside that zone the vast majority of the time, and so you would just kind of label them a support player just on the grounds that they spend a lot of their doing that sort of thing, whereas maybe other players like a Stewie, a Tarek, a Twist, an Af, or whatever are very much mixed in what they might be doing in a round. Hell, even someone like Glaive, I would almost consider him more of an entry fragger, because he kind of pairs up with Dupree as kind of an entry duo in a lot of Astralis' default rounds. But if you look at statistics on flash assist and flash success and stuff like that, Glaive's actually the number 2 player in the world behind Fallen in that regard. And Fallen's number 1 player in that regard, and he's an opper. Yet he has some of the best flashing statistics of any player in the world right now, for flash assists per round, flash success, things like that, which you would think flashing for your teammates would be considered a supportive thing to do. Yet, like I said, some of the best players in the world in doing it are guys like Fallen and Glaive, who you wouldn't consider them support players per se. So I think what you really have to think about when you define a support player or someone who's being supportive, whether it's temporary, kind of just in a transition, doing it sometimes, but sometimes being more of a entry frag or whatever their other thing is that they do for the team. Really, the whole point of calling someone a supporter is just saying that they sacrifice themselves for the better of their team or for the better for another star player on the team. And they can either do this by setting them up with utility, or you can set up players by creating space, like what MSL used to do for Config on North, for example. Yeah. He was an entry fragger, but not really traditionally. It's not like he was getting kills. It was more like creating space for Config. But also...
See, this is an interesting point, though. It is, and what kind of entry fragging is supportive and what kind isn't?
It depends on I would say it depends on the difficulty of the entry. I think the way that MSL you would set up config isn't through, okay, we're going to do the execute, all the flashbangs, smokes are out, and the mollies, and now we're going to go, and I'm going to go out first. It's more like when they're trying to gain map control through long or a really hard spark to clear, like double doors on DusT 2, that's when you see MSL doing more of the being far out in front. That's how I define that. But I think in this discussion already, we sort of got into some classic tropes that maybe I don't like, is a little too personalized, but I think is skew in how we frame the term support player, because I think that traditionally when we think of roles, we think of the T side, and I think that sort of only covers half the game. I think, DusT, you were talking about spacing and their slots, and I think that's more of this idea of where do they fall into the like conga line. This is how I think people like have to imagine it, like a conga line of players moving into a site, which is obviously, I mean, we have to define it like that because it gets too complicated otherwise, because, you know, there's two groups and then who's the entry player. It gets a little confusing. But on the T side, this is how I define it, and you guys can respond to this and tell me I'm wrong or I'm right. I think that there are certain spots that are just naturally, I would define them as being more positioning and utility oriented rather than aim oriented. And you could say spots like enter on train, be on Inferno, be on Mirage, ramp room on Nuke. It's a little bit more difficult with Cache, but maybe the A player, the A anchor player, or the B anchor player on Cache, that's more difficult because of the fluidity of the positions, because of the big mid on Cache. Sort of roles like
T
this.
side or CT side?
CT
Yeah,
side.
you said.
Oh, I
Yeah,
said
yeah,
T
you
side.
said
I do
T
that
side.
all the time. It's so
Yeah.
that's the most frustrating shit.
So
dude.
clarify
I do
which
that
side?
Yeah, so people play on CT
CT.
side. CT.
Okay.
So inner sight on B and on
Sure.
inner sight on train. Okay, getting all the words right. Yeah, so all those spots like that, like where it's not necessarily about, okay, I'm in ladder room on train and I'm just going to spray two people who are jumping, literally falling into my crosshair, right? It's more about, okay, I spot the guy, I reposition, I throw the molly down the bomb site, and then I wait for teammates, or I try to get that one good spray where I get one guy or two guys or 1.5 guys, something like this. I mean, is that how... in my mind, I very closely connect the idea of CT anchor roles, specifically on like small sites or sites that are manned by a single person or are hard to manage, with the idea of support player. Do you guys make that connection?
No.
Sometimes, but
I mean, but
stereotypically,
Zenix plays all those spots.
Yeah, but here's a spot that I deem to be a support position that isn't a small side anchor, and it's the rotator role on arch side of Inferno. Like that,
I would say that's like
player's-
a 4 slot out of if you're going from
Like
star
that-
1 to
but
support 5.
Like you're involved in the play, but you're not there to get a multi-kill. You're there to get information, and you'll very often fall back, and you'll often be locked out of a round if an execute steamrolls your team on the A site. So that player is not going to get a ton of frags, generally speaking. He might, especially if he plays it differently. If you're very aggressive in the way that you handle it, you might get more frags. But generally speaking, and so that's how I think that you should gauge these, is how many frags are you going to get in this position relative to another person, right? So Stiko might get less kills than Olaf would in one position, and that but if they're playing the different positions, that's useless. You need to compare them in the same positions and how are they fragging in this situation. And that's because the word support player really only exists because we're referring to stats, and because stats are generally a pretty good way of evaluating individual form, we need to use a term to justify why that isn't a good way of explaining or judging the performance of certain players. We want to say, oh, here's why, even though Taco is the worst rated player on Liquid, he isn't the worst player on Liquid, or he shouldn't be cut. And so we have to explain that by saying, here are the things that he's doing that aren't gauged by stats. But Connector on Inferno, or sorry, not well, Connector, more Arch side, Arch is not one of those roles where your function, unlike Pit, for example, where your function is very much to get multi-kills. That's why you're there. And so I don't think it's just, and none of these, by the way, none of these things are absolute. Like, it's not like you're not supposed to get kills in Arch side, right? It's just that I would believe, generally speaking, the person that's on that Arch side is going to get fewer kills than the person who's on the side, whether he's in Pit or not.
Yeah, I think it just depends all about like where your opera plays on CT side Inferno, because there are many teams who like to position their opera towards the B side of the map. Like a lot of the Brazilian teams, for instance, are super famous for this, Fallen being the most famous of all for doing this. But classically speaking, usually opera's played Arch side middle. Like that was kind of like the most classic spot. Like Kenny S, for instance, is probably the most famous for this.
Yeah,
like in the early days. I think the meta's kind of shifted because CTs give up mid more now than maybe they used to in the past, where they would kind of hold it more up front. Like if you go years back, like people would really try to
Yes.
hold brackets with ops and like actually take those picks in the middle. But now a lot of times people will fade back more towards library moto, maybe even give up some of that space and kind of just make sure they can't wrap. So I think it all depends on kind of like
for sure.
Like where your opera plays most often on Inferno depends on whether that art side player is going to be more supportive or it's going to be your opera actually trying to get kills at mid. But I also just going to this point that Walla Bibita was making about how, you know, there's certain CT positions that are just classically more supportive. I don't think that it's fair to call someone supportive just because they're being a small site bomb anchor, because I think that many star players are sometimes the small site bomb anchor, like depending on what team you're playing. I think if you really wanted to come up with the definition for like support player on CT side, I think it would probably be more of the rotators who throw utility to set up the opper or like throw utility to set up someone pushing. Like for instance, if you're throwing the utility to set up a short B push on the CT side of overpass, or you're the guy throwing utility to set up your opera on the A side of the map on overpass, like that probably is the guy who's more of a support player than simply the guy anchoring a certain small site on the map.
That's
like
I
don't know.
or ramp or whatever.
I'm not sure. I think it depends on the map because
I think it's map dependent. Like I think, sorry to cut you off, but like Mirage, for example, no, let's say Overpass, for example, to use yours. I think on that B side, there's usually two guys, and one guy is sort of like will be the barrels player, and the other guy will be like water or something and try to set him up, or maybe he'll play closer to monster, and there'll be a second guy usually setting him up, and that's the guy I would typically consider the support player of the most supportive player on the map. Though you could obviously say the person who rotates from A to B is a supportive player, or you know maybe there's some interplay between the two B players on Overpass. It's I mean it is a rough frame, but there was a rough outline. It's hard to pin down. Like I specifically said with Cash, like that's hard to pin down in my mind. Who is the support player? I think it's obviously very difficult, and we're just trying to have a language to describe how Counter-Strike works. There's no, of course, like you were saying earlier, there's no Lulu, there's no Sona, there's no. These are League of Legends support champions for people.
Well, can I at least put this one out there? Yeah. I feel this is the trap that most people fall into that I think we could probably all agree on as consensus, just to say like what support players aren't, and then we could kind of like start maybe defining a little bit like what are supportive players. So I feel like first off, I feel like what a lot of people will do is like if X player is not an entry fragger, if he is not the second entry fragger, if he is not the primary opper, then he must be the support player. I feel a lot of people do that, by the way. I feel like a lot of people are just like, oh, well, he's not one of the entries. He's not the op. He's not the in-game leader, so he must be the support player just by, like, virtue of process of elimination. Yeah. This guy must be the support player. Also, a lot of times I feel like people just anytime someone's, like, more of a maybe not like a lurker because classic lurking doesn't really exist anymore, but let's just say peripheral player. That's the term I like to use, by the way.
It's a great term.
Perimeter player, I think I like.
Plays the solo player, like plays the edge of the map by himself, or like maybe he plays stairs and overpass by himself if you don't want to say edge of the map necessarily. But like say on Cash, you are playing the edge of the map if you're playing outside B or you're playing squeaky door. So a lot of people will just call edge of the map players or peripheral players support players, but that's not really true either because it just depends on the player. Like for instance, maybe someone like Zipix is a little bit more supportive when he's playing the edge of the map, but someone like Shox or Olaf or Nico or when Simple played on Team Liquid when he wasn't the opper, or there's a bunch of riflers you could point to that play the edge of the map that are playmakers. Like they're guys that are looking to create space, get a kill, make a play. And so it's not really fair just to like label any peripheral player support player. And I think a lot of people fall into that trap. So those aren't support players necessarily. They could be, but it all depends on what player it is and what exactly they like to do and what their skill set is and stuff like that.
It depends on
I just wanted to kind of kill some of those things that I see happen.
I think as a general rule, it's pretty good. Even if you like, let's say I don't watch a lot of teams. So if I want to talk about heroic and I watch a VOD or two of theirs and I look at the positions, I might put my expectations of their frag levels based on their positions, even though that might be inappropriate if I watch more VODs. Both, but I was thinking he was talking about T, so I was thinking. But there's some spots that I think are generally pretty good at. Most people play them incredibly passively. Like I'm thinking T side monster on overpass. Generally, people play very passively. I know sometimes people make individual plays, but they almost never do. And so when you're looking at someone like, they don't even have to be support players. Like on old Cloud9, I don't know about now, but on old Cloud9, Tim used to be the periphery player on that. He used to lurk around Monster, and like that definitely had an effect on his frags. Like on that map, he was not very involved. So it's fine, like because they had a bunch of other entry players, they didn't need him to do entry work there. But that's just an example of saying like, okay, well maybe Tim has, instead of having a 1.18 rating, he has a 1.12 rating on Overpass, but that's not because he's worse on Overpass than other maps. It's because he's on this spot and he's not getting as involved in the play on this map. You know, that's like a good way of explaining where otherwise you might have thought that he's worse on the map. You say, oh no, look, this is one spot. But it's definitely true that there are other spots. Like for example, when you're lurking B apps on Mirage, there's some players that play that incredibly passively and some that don't at all. That's why I said Oscar, because obviously Oscar is famous for going there and trying to find picks over and over again.
Chris J.
Like, or like Henny gets that too. Like those players, although Henny gets so much support, it's ridiculous. But anyway, I think you do have to look at play style a great deal. But I think there definitely is an archetype of a player. Like if you look at what Sticko does, you can almost guess everything that he does based on what you know about him. Like you know his personality and certain roles, and you're like, okay, well he probably does this, and he probably does this, and he probably does this, and he doesn't frag very much. And like that. So I think that it's a generally useful way of describing people. Like, okay, here's an example. I don't know that much about Hellraisers because whenever I watch Hellraisers, I don't watch them to evaluate the team or anything like that. I just want to watch Woxic play. So I don't really know how they play. I know Dead Fox's general roles, but not a great deal. I couldn't give them to you in detail. Yet I would feel relatively comfortable saying that Dead Fox plays the most despicable roles. You know.
Gotta keep them alive.
And that could actually justify or explain.
That's another good point, by the way. Like, because you just brought this whole despicable thing. Like, again, it all comes down to like whether or not support players exist and who's a support player. All comes down to how you want to define the word support player. And I kind of gave some things a little bit earlier about how I define a support player. Like, you know, someone who is sacrificing himself for a star or the betterment of the team, setting up people with utility or by creating space. But another thing the other things you can talk about, like if you want to be a little bit more liberal with the term support player to try to like encapsulate more people or give more people credit for being supportive, you could simply say that people who are willing to take bitch spots and no one else wants to play are considered support players because they're supporting my stars by letting their star players get to play positions they're going to excel in, and then you just take the bitch spots that the star players aren't going to excel in or aren't going to get impact from or don't want to play. And so by virtue of you just being willing to do that, you're being more of a supportive guy for your teammate. And then the other big problem, since you brought up Sticko, is that I feel like a lot of supportive elements of someone like that are things that we don't get to see while we're watching the game, but we only find out afterwards through like interviews and stuff. Like, for example, the big thing that was famous about Sticko was how much he facilitated communication and how much Mousesports missed that when he was gone.
Especially when you lose someone like Snacks who didn't apparently speak English pretty well.
Right. So you could call someone who is facilitating communication, making sure people are on the same page, calling things for people, maybe even secondary calling to a degree. You could call that person a support player too, because how he's supporting the team strategy by facilitating communication. So it really just depends on how loose you want to be with the definition of the word. Depends on how many people fit into the category.
But I think it's a term of justification for poor fragging. Like that's what I think it is.
Not necessarily, because some people who fit this mold aren't poor fraggers.
Right, but remember that like Zipex is not a poor fragger.
Exactly, neither is Glaive.
Perfectly into that mold.
Right, but also the term support player as applied to Zipex came up when he was about to get kicked from TSM, and people were like, oh, you know, but he's a support player. He helps his teammates and all that, even though he has a below 1.0 rating and things like that. So like Zipex also was a bad fragger at one point in time when Astralis was a much worse team, or when they weren't Astralis at all. So I do think that label gets applied. For example, people haven't used that term really to describe people like Olaf Meister, even though I think that at some points in time and phase, Olaf Meister was a pretty good candidate to be called.
No, I think that fits on Olaf Meister, even though he has fragging. I'm actually not. But the point. Yeah, go ahead.
But if you want to use like Rain, is Rain better than Olaf Meister, right? At least let's say in 2017, because Rain is obviously something right now.
Yeah.
Like in 2017, I would say no, probably not. Like, he's a much better fragger.
Okay.
He has a much higher rating, but is he really a better player? Well, if you look at the roles and all that, you can look at the function that Olaf is playing, and it makes sense that he has a worse rating than Rain, even though he had a very high individual level, right? And maybe if he was in Rain spots, maybe FaZe wouldn't be better off. My point is, maybe you could say he's playing as well as Rain given his role. That doesn't mean that he should be rated number 4 in the world or whatever he was rated. That's not what I'm saying. I don't believe in that's how rating should work. But I still think that when you're judging like whether or not, when fans are calling to kick someone, I would be very wary, of kicking Olafmeister before Rain.
Exactly.
So and that has to do with the supportive label, which is that if you look at rating, you're not getting the full story on this player because he's fulfilling functions that aren't related to fragging.
I think it also is just like, even if you are like playing more supportive positions, I think it is just the case when you're thinking about cutting players. I feel like there is at least some minimum threshold of fragging you must meet to where you are a burden on your team.
So here's an example. Like, Dead Fox plays the most despicable roles, but he also has currently a 0.88 rating on HLTV over the past 3 months. That's lower than Daps. That's lower, and you're not going to tell me that Dead Fox is more supportive than Daps is. Like, Daps basically lives to support his team. Like, he has a worse rating than MSL, worse rating than Zeus. So like, that's really bad compared to Stico, who's at a 1.01 right now, right? Or you look at Fugly, right? Like, I know Fugly isn't completely like Stico, but sort of similar. That player has a decent fragging level, so for sure. And I do think that there's something to the fact that your supportive roles are more replaceable than your superstar roles, insofar as if you take like a general like replacement level player and you put him in a support role, he's going to do better than if you put him in a star role. So if you kick Stico to get stacks, that's not great, but there are probably more players that can play like Stico than there are players that can play like Sunny or Oscar.
Okay, that
was the big misnomer, though, right? Because like because I think this will like set up Wallaby here in just a second. Okay. Is that a lot of people, when Stico first got removed from Mouse Sports, thought it was a bad idea because they were like, oh, you're kicking your support player. Like, even though he was like statistically their worst player or whatever, you felt like, that's probably not the player you need to kick. Like, he does a lot for the team that goes unnoticed or what have you or whatever. I was totally fine with it. I was totally fine with kicking Stico. The problem was
Snacks.
Who you chose to replace him with. That was the problem. Because here's the deal. Mouse Sports could have kept Stico and probably remained like a top 5 team in the world. But guess what, bro? They were never going to surpass Astralis. They were never going to surpass FaZe probably on a regular basis. They were never going to do those things because, and one of the reasons why is because of Stico's weak individual play in comparison to how good the output was for teams like FaZe and Astralis that had, super sick players in almost every single spot. So one of the ways they were going to attempt to try to catch those guys was by replacing Stico with maybe a more skilled player to try to get on the same level as those guys individually. But the problem was they picked the wrong person.
Right,
so
but
I don't
also
think it's necessarily fair to say that like Stico was like some magic glue that held Mouse Sports together to make them a top 5 team in the world.
The thing is,
like,
it might be in Mouse Sports' case because of the communication, but if you're looking at the in-game stuff...
We didn't know that at the time, right?
Right. But I'm just talking about the in-game stuff. Like, obviously, you want someone who can be supportive in a room. But in the game, I think that a lot of people can play supportive roles. Like, I really do. Like, I think Tarek can play a support. Like, I think it's fine.
He's being forced to right now.
Yeah.
Right. But he was a lot on Cloud9 as well, on CT side. Not on T side, but on CT side. And so, to me, like, that's like, okay. Like, for example, when Stewie2K got added to MIBR, I, at least in my own mind, famously said that it would work, and it didn't. But one of the reasons I thought it might work is because I think that Stewie2K has a perfectly fine skill set to do a lot of the roles that he's being asked to do. He played a lot of anchor roles on Cloud9. It turned out that there were other issues going on, especially with his, like, let's say, like, style, his aggressive style of play. But so it didn't work out. But the point is that a lot of these, not everyone, but a lot of these players can fulfill that function. It probably won't be like Shocks or Snacks or someone like that. But there are tons of players that I think can play Stico's roles and play them like perfectly fine. And so it makes sense to replace him. Like, he's more replaceable in that sense. But I think that the problem is that when people are asking him to cut him, They're asking, let's find someone who can frag more. And so they look for someone who can frag more. But you're not looking for someone who can frag more. You're looking for someone who can fulfill the same functions as Sticko is fulfilling, and then do slightly better in some way. That might be fragging. But in this case, there's just, definitely not Snacks, because yes, Snacks is probably even I'd say marginally better fragger than at this point in his career than Sticko is. Mm-hmm. But he fulfilled for Mouseboy specifically with the communication, but also just anchor roles and lurking roles. He was much less successful in those roles, or much less, slightly less. Yeah. So it turned out in that situation. But I don't think I think there's a taboo right now, saying oh, we should never cut any support players. And I just don't buy that. I think if you look at players like Fugly wasn't a support player. Now he is. He can do it fine.
Okay. Well, we went through a whole lot of topics there, but I think let me try to pin this down, because there's. Sure. Let's go. I'm gonna go all the way back to what you were saying, DusT, with how I'm trying to remember exactly what you said. I think that well, okay, let me actually go back. Let's just go to something Sam said, because I can actually remember that off the top of my head right now. You were saying that that support player is a position that people just throw on players who are underrated in terms of fragging, which is something I agree to a certain extent. I think people do a bad job of differentiating roles from output, right? When you were sort of talking about the interplay between how roles and output should coalesce, right? So, for example, I think a good example of the opposite direction, someone who had really bad stats, but I wouldn't describe as a support player at all, would be Zeus in Gambit in 2017. I mean, look at his CT roles and his T roles. I don't think that he was playing a supportive style in any sense. I think that he was giving himself, if he had control of the CT roles, very strong spots, like I mentioned, ladder room on Train. I think that's a great spot for kills, right? Just people just fall into your crosshair, right? And you can maybe get, if you're a spray dart arch, you get 2 kills. Or a round you can swing out into the yard and get a 3rd kill, right? Right behind the planning team. So I think you're right on that, Sam. And I think to a certain degree...
Here's another example. Okay, just to add to your example with someone who people hate less, right, than Zeus. Mm-hmm. Stewie 2K in Cloud9 was not a traditional support player, never had a good rating, pretty much ever. People think that Stewie 2K was a star, and I do think that he was a great player, but Stewie 2K was not some frag monster, and yet he wasn't a support player. There's other ways even effective ways of fragging poorly.
Yeah.
A lot of entry fraggers, for instance, just by virtue of their role, aren't always going to have the biggest numbers as a secondary entry or an opper, because sometimes they're going into unfavorable situations because they're always going in first. Yeah. And so if the utility didn't work, then they might just get blindsided, right? Or they might get the kill just because they have super sick aim. But often than not, they get put in more difficult situations, and so they are at times going to have less rating for that very reason.
Right. Or a player who feels
a lot of impact because of the space they create.
Right. Or a player who always feels like he needs to make a play because his team is too bad without it. I think of Stewie 2K, I think of Nico and Mouseboys, who felt like he was always doing something, because if he didn't do something, his team didn't have enough to actually succeed.
Okay, I remember the thing. Okay, you were talking about T roles and how that correlates to a supportive role. I sort of defined it in my mind, even though I didn't have a good consensus with me, but I want to get my opinion out there with T roles too, and then you can sort of respond to it. With what position someone is as a support player on T, I think is very variable and very team dependent. But I think, to go back to DusT's idea of not trying to define something about what it is not, I don't define a support player on T side by how many flashbangs someone throws, or how many how much success people have with flashbangs. That's a skill unto itself. But I think that's sort of an old school definition of support player who throws the flashbang. I think it's very contextual. If you're, like I was saying with MSL earlier, if you're entering on all the hard spots so someone can trade off of you, that's supportive, right? Or if you're being a periphery player on a map that or an area that doesn't get a lot of support, but you're a good distraction, say, like you were saying earlier, Sam, Squeaky Room on Cash when they're about to do a B execute, that's sort of supportive if you're playing that more passively. But it's hard. I think it's hard to define what a support player is on T side, like coming up with the general principle. But I do think that someone who does just hold flanks, I think that's sort of the thing I look for, like Skadoodle on Cloud9 in 2017, who's just not a part of the main force and just will, say, hold apartments on Mirage B and just wait for the rotators to come in, not be part of the sort of tip of the spear. That's a very supportive job, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it kind of goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, where a lot of people fall into the trap of labeling someone a support player simply because of the physical position they take up on the T-side default, for instance. But I don't think that's really fair. Like, I think the better way to do it is probably just label like people as like your main control group, like your entry, secondary entry, and your opper, and then have your two peripheral players or your two edge of the map or two solo players, whatever you want to call those guys. It doesn't matter. Like, give them their physical label for the physical position that they play. But then within that system, certain people are going to be more supportive depending on the tactic at hand or the map at play, or just the particular, like, very micro situation they just happen to be in. Like, for instance, Fallen is a primary opper. You wouldn't really necessarily consider oppers necessarily supportive, because usually they're trying to get picks, or, you know, they're trying to make plays or what have you. And that used to be the case for Fallen a lot of the time with AWP and earlier versions of his teams. But on this particular team that he's on right now, Made in Brazil, I would say that on the T side, he is actually more of a support player. Why? Because a lot of times he's just holding more passive angles with an op while other people are making plays with rifles. And he is one of the big guys that will kind of sit back and throw utility to facilitate guys like Fur, Stewie, Tarek going in to try to mix and trade into a bomb site. Cold actually kind of does that too, but he always historically kind of did. So even though you wouldn't think of an opper classically as a supportive player, the way in which Fallen is using the op on the T side for Made in Brazil in a lot of maps is going to be a little bit more supportive. But then there's going to be other rounds where he is the one going for the pick. So it's not a zone he sits in all the time, but he can become that depending on the task at hand. And I think that you could say that for a lot of different players. You know, sometimes you are going to be the guy dumping utility for other guys to go and run into a bomb site, and so in that moment you are the support. You are the guy being supportive. But in other tactics or on other maps, depending on what spot you play or depending on your team's system, you may actually be the one running it, and someone else might be throwing the utility for you. So I think the problem is some people sometimes get in their head that, like, being a support player is like a permanent role that you hold 100% of the time, and I don't think that that's how it works at all.
No,
I think that.
But some people fall into that category better than others.
Sure, like if you are doing that more often than not, like let's say you're the one dumping utility for an execute like 60% or more of the time, then yeah, we probably would just call you a support player by virtue that that's the majority of the role that you fill. But for someone like Fallen, you know, who does it for MIBR right now, it's hard to call him a support player, but that's kind of what he's doing on T-sides all the time nowadays for his team because of the personnel that they have. So, again, like, I think it just depends on how you define the word support player and what kind of threshold you want to put on how often do they need to be doing this thing for me to say that, yes, that is a support player. Or is it more of he's a hybrid player, like sometimes he's going to entry, sometimes he's going to set other people up. Liquid and Made in Brazil are the perfect examples in the current moment of teams that have those types of players right now. Whereas Astralis, their roles are a little bit more finite. Like, almost always you know what everyone's going to do, whereas people are a little bit more flexible on teams like Liquid and Made in Brazil. So I think that, again, it just all comes down to how you want to define the word.
Sam, how would you define like, in your mind, how
I don't think it's the definition of the word. I think we're all agreeing more or less on what the definition of the word is. I think the trouble was thinking of it as scalar instead of binary. Like, it's definitely not. And I think the problem is that we want to use in order to make sense of the game, we want to use archetypes like entry fragger and lurker and things like that. And there's some teams that betray those archetypes. So, like, Liquid is a great example, but MIBR is probably the best example. Like, I mean, I haven't studied them deeply, but I have watched their games, and I would have a hard time telling you the role of each individual player because I don't think that our labels apply particularly well to any of those players. Like, you wouldn't, other than Coldzera, you wouldn't put, like, okay, here's where I expect him to be in fragging. Like, okay, it's Cold, and then it's Fur, and then it's Stewie, and then it doesn't really work like that. It's just kind of like there's this whole jumble of aggressive riflers around, and they do things. You know, and so I think that in those cases, you want to be careful about using those labels. I would not use those labels if I wanted to talk about MIBR. And if you wanted to evaluate their performances, you would do a very bad job by just looking at the stats. Unlike, for example, if you're looking at mouse sports, I think you do a better job by looking at the stats. I say, having not watched a shit ton of mouse sports lately. Okay. But I would assume that if you look at, like, you can gauge whether Sunny or Oscar had good games more or less by their stats, at least across the whole tournament, whether they had good lands. Like, Sunny just blew up. I just saw before we started the show, Sunny blew up.
He had a great game on Train.
Yeah. So I bet you that he had great frags. He had a high frag count. I bet you he had a great game, right? Mm-hmm. But when I look at, like, Stewie has a 1.05 rating. I don't know what that is. I don't know if he played great. I don't know if he played terrible. I don't know that. I don't know the same for like Fur or for Terry. And all those players are hovering around that range right now. So they're like 105 to 102 to 112, sort of around there. And I don't know who's playing well or who's playing poorly. If you really wanted to do a good job with those players, you'd have to go and watch their VODs or watch their demos and watch their POV and see what they're doing and see whether they're doing it successfully. Meanwhile, if you want to judge Sunny, you probably have to work a lot less hard, right? So sometimes, my point is sometimes those archetypes work. In some teams they work, and in some teams they don't work at all. And it's not just for the support player. It applies to the lurker position, the entry fragger position.
Sometimes the mold that we use to define...
Okay. I was just going to say, this come down to the fact that if you want to label someone support just because they're merely taking a spot that people don't want to play.
Yeah.
Like, you just want to get your stars in more favorable positions because they're comfortable playing those positions. That's where they feel that they can excel the most and have the most impact and get the most kills to give you the best chances to win. And then these other guys are just kind of taking up the slack. Like, do you want to label that person a support player simply because they're doing that or not? Like, that's something you have to kind of decide for yourself or not.
Okay.
Certainly, that is a supportive quality to be willing to do that. It's all a mentality thing, though, at that point. It's not even the role that you play. It's like the mentality that you have.
But generally, the spots that people don't want to play are low fragging spots. Not universally, but generally speaking.
Yeah,
like,
I look at what this.
Go ahead.
Like, how would you define, or same too, how would you define bitch spot? Because you used that term earlier, and sort of, I got a little confused when you were describing that, and hopefully you could clarify for me.
Just a spot that no one wants to play. Like, for example, no one wants to play...
No. Was that in the context of the team, or is that in the context of the game? Is it a spot like Ramp or Nuke, or is it a spot within, okay, I want to play this spot, I want to play this spot, it's just within the context of the team, no one wants to have to play outside or something?
I think there's just certain spots, kind of like what Sam was saying, that are just not usually going to give you much of a chance to have a crazy impact, unless you just so happen... the team just likes to hit that bomb side a lot. Yeah. Like, for example, if you're like, or same with T-side, like there's some spots you're just going to play on T-side, you're probably not going to see a lot of action, like playing outside B on overpass, for instance. Or, there are certain, like anchoring the B bomb side on Mirage, if a team's just playing a lot of like mid control and A splits, and you're probably not going to see a whole lot of action, so you are kind of playing a little bit of a bitch spot. Or at least that's kind of phrase it as. But
it can have to do with team dynamics too. Like I look at like a DAPS, and I'm just looking at what DAPS does in a lot of rounds on overpass on CT side, and it's just like, okay, I'm going to boost Ethan here, and then I'm going to boost Ethan here, and then I'll boost here too. It's like, and when I look at that, and I look at DAPS has a 0.91 HLTV rating, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, whatever. Like basically, normally by the time the DAPS gets involved in a B site round, the round's probably over, or it's a 2v2. Like, he's just not there to frag. It's just not what he's doing. He's there to set up. He's an extremely talented player. To me, when I look at that, I say, okay, well, I don't use the word bitch spot, but it's fine. You can use the word bitch spot. Like, no one wants to do that. He's doing nothing. He's barely playing the game at that point, and no one would possibly want that role, but he knows he's less skilled than his very skilled teammates, and so he thinks that's valuable to take that, to make that sacrifice. So I would say that's a bitch spot, but I would have qualms about using that term universally for like any spot. For example, B-side Mirage, I think that some players play it much more aggressively than others and will hunt for picks and push to make it rotate way more quickly. So like I think of Tarek on Cloud9, who would opt very frequently. Like I know Taco opts too there, but like Tarek was very aggressive with the AWP. And he would go there, he would get resources invested into him, and he would get flashed in. He would try to get a pick, and he would rotate quickly if there wasn't any action. So when I look at that, and I look at Skadoodle in window, and I say, well, given their spots, you'd think that Skadoodle is the star opper, but he's not. Like, the way they're playing, Tarek is the star opper, even though he's playing the worst role.
But
right?
you
So
would
it
agree
depends.
generally that the yeah, it's a sort of like you have to. It's hard. You're trying to, like you were talking about before with players in a team. It's just trying who fits the mold the best. Like the B anchor on Mirage is like the best general idea of where a support player would play, even though, as you're saying, it's dependent on team dynamics and how the player plays the spot, right? You could play that spot very aggressively. You could try to, push into apartments every round, right?
But to be fair, even if you play very aggressively on B apartments, you're going to get less kills than your compatriot on cap. Like
Right,
that's
of
just
course.
a general rule.
Yeah.
But my point is that what you can expect and frag output from Tarek playing B site is different from I would eat like Zipnix. Or maybe actually Zipnix has switched up. So let's not use Zipnix as an example. I don't know, like Taco's relatively passive
Yep.
on that spot, at least when he doesn't
I
have an
think
option.
CT side support's way harder to You could say that someone anchoring a small side that doesn't typically see a lot of action, but you kind of still have to hold it, respect the fact that maybe it does get hit, and that does free up other players on your team to go make plays like being aggressive in middle or like pushing somewhere or just whatever. Like by virtue of the fact that you are anchoring that lesser hit bomb site so that other people have their freedom to make plays across the map, then yes, you could be supportive. But who else could be supportive is the guy things that people need to make the push into middle or whatever. So I think that again, it like all depends on your definition of the word. Like, is it support by virtue of the fact that you're just doing something that no one else wants to do, or are you supportive just because you're simply anchoring so other people can go make plays? Are you supportive because you're the one actually throwing the utility so guys can make plays? It probably all fits, but then that means a lot of different people are playing support on CT side.
But my point, what I've been trying to say is, I think that you say someone is supportive insofar as they play in a way that sacrifices their frag count, and that's how we should use the term. And that doesn't mean there are very few people that are just all out. You can say like, okay, well, whatever their stats are, it doesn't really matter. Like I don't even think there's a single player whose stats don't matter. But you can excuse some players more than others based on the amount of supportive positions that they have, right? So the cap player does a ton of supporting because he's going to use a ton of utility to help the guy that's in connector trying to get picks, depending on who's playing connector. But at the same time, that guy's going to be very involved in plays if the T side tries to get mid control. And generally speaking, in the current meta, people try to get a lot of mid control. So that player is going to have a higher frag count or higher expected frag count than the player playing on B site on an average map, not on every map, but on an average map, right? Even though the cap player is doing a lot of supporting as well. I think it's important to realize that it's not just the role that someone's playing and so forth, the spot that someone's playing. It also has to do with the way that people play it.
Yeah.
I can totally imagine someone, I can't think of one outright, but I can imagine someone who plays cat, who plays very passively around cat, and who won't get a lot of frags because he's not willing to peek, like dry peek when they're doing an A split, when he's not to contest ladder room control and things like that. I can imagine that as well, and I would look at that player, even though he's playing cat, which is generally a pretty high fragging position, and say, okay, that guy's playing it passively. Maybe he's playing it poorly, but he's playing it in a way that you wouldn't expect him to get a lot of frags. So I'll cut him some slack for that.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to get into this other thing you guys mentioned, which is the sort of mutability of star players into support players. I think there's a sort of a very sort of not controversial, but hard to. There's a lot of people on both sides. Like I think with the Sicko example, the Sicko snack example is like the best example of someone trying to mold a former star player into a support player. Maybe maybe like in the case of an IP, you could talk about maybe that Force or Get Right should be tried to be transmuted into more of a supportive element of the team to make way for more stars. But how capable are they going to be to do that? And I think that there are some purists, like you were saying earlier, Sam, was no, you should never try to make star players and support this could not work out. But then you have an example like Olaf Meister on FaZe, where I think, okay, we disagree about the definition of support, kind of, so it's hard to call him a support player. But I generally would put him, at least, especially in comparison to his past roles on other teams, I would definitely put him more into supportive camp.
on
I think
this
it's
team
map
on
specific
phase.
for Olaf.
Yes,
I
it's
think
a
it's
little
map
more,
specific.
and it changes,
Yeah, it does change.
with time.
Like on
But-
on Mirage, I would say Olaf is not really too much of
No.
a support. He's actually helping a lot with map control, whereas on other maps, maybe he is kind of taking a little bit of a backseat. So I think it's a little bit dependent. Also, FaZe is just kind of swapping things all the time.
Yeah.
Yes, but that has.
I mean,
to
like
do with
old school
their
phase. I think
Sure.
Olaf was more.
2017 phase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think,
But if you think about, that was a very successful roster move, right? Switching out Kiyoshima, who people had decided was a support player, with Olaf Meister, who people had decided wasn't a support player. Even though Kiyoshima himself wasn't a support player until he started playing in Kerrigan's phase. And so people, I think people brand people as support players and don't believe that anyone can turn into a support player until they've done it, and then they brand them as a support player.
Well, it's like
So-
hard to figure out whether or not someone can do it, right? You don't know
I mean-
until they actually do it. If they,
I mean, I guess, but I'm of the mindset of, I don't know people's character, so I don't know if you have a big ego, you're not going to do very well because okay. I don't think Ethan would be a great support player
no,
because Ethan's very young and he seems like a very confident lad, but I would presume that he plays a lot on confidence, and so if he wasn't doing very well, that would steamroll, right? But Olaf Meister is like a G, and he's been around forever, and he's an incredibly smart player. What part of his skill set isn't suited to fulfilling any role that like Sticko plays? I don't see anything in that other than the fact that we want to say one is a support and one isn't, that makes me think that he's unable to fulfill those functions. I look at Snacks and I think there are a ton of reasons that guy can't fulfill those functions. That is a terrible move. But I look at Olaf, and at the time, by the way, I will say I was wrong, and I thought that this was a risky move, because I always thought of Olaf, and still do, as an aggressive rifler, as a playmaking rifler, and I underestimated his capability or his versatility. But this goes to show that we shouldn't be so like haughty in saying like, oh no, never do those moves, never cut Sticko and things like that. I think that there's a ton of players that were used to be star players that aren't, like Zipex. So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like virtually any player who has a good in-game IQ and has the mentality to be a support player, like knowing that, hey, I'm going to have to make sacrifices to facilitate other people, knowing I'm going to have to take a backseat in certain situations where maybe I would have in the past been more of the playmaker. I think almost any star player who can have that switch in mentality and does have a good enough in-game IQ to kind of have a sense for like timings and rotations and things like that, I think virtually anybody with those characteristics could be a good support player.
Right.
I think that what separates people who could be a good support player from people who can't be is all about the mentality that they have about the game and how good their in-game IQ is.
Yeah, and
Because
in-game
I think
IQ,
that like mechanical skill, I mean, if you have good mechanics as like an entry fragger, you're going to have fine mechanics as a support player. It's just going to be about the mentality and like I said, how you read the game. I think that's what matters most.
Yeah, I think it's in-game exactly right, because when I look at Zipex, who I think is an amazing player, and Sticko, who I think is a pretty good player, like, what's the difference between the two? I don't think it's aim, and I think most people would say, like, oh yeah, but like Zipex is just better individually. Like, he is, but not because of his aim. Like, Zipex has fine aim. I think it's because Zipex is one of the smartest players in the game, and Sticko is fine, but I don't think Sticko is one of the smartest players in the game. And you look at the difference. So, for example, I think Flusha would make a great support player, because I think Flusha is one of the smartest players that have ever played Counter-Strike or CSGO. And so I look at him, and I'm like, yeah, of course, put him in anchor roles and put him in lurking roles, and he'll do fantastic, right? But I look at someone like Snacks, and I'm like, no, this guy seems to play way more off intuition. And even though I do think that Snacks has pretty good game sense, I think that he has pretty good game sense when someone's executing onto him and he wants to make a crazy play. So, and I think I don't know why that's different, but by watching the game, I can tell that it's very different, because I look at Snacks in another situation, and that's the same thing that happened to me with Stewie2K, where I think Stewie2K has a good aggressive response mechanism, but a very bad passive response mechanism, or at least it doesn't trigger often enough.
Yeah.
I guess to go back to the point I was making, that like virtually anyone can do it if they have the mentality and the game sense. Because here's the thing: what I hate when people say is like no one can do what Sticko can do. I think that is just the dumbest thing ever, because yes, I think the thing you should be saying is anyone willing to do what Sticko is willing to do? And I think that's like the key difference. And like people need to stop saying no one can do what he can do, and need to start saying, well, we need to see if people have the same mentality, the same mindset to do what he's going to do. And I think that's the phrase you should be using.
Yes,
I think that's a big problem.
I mean, you think, like, to go to Sam's point, I think, like, a player like Fur, you think just instantly, you know, like, oh, okay, that guy's a support player. Just because, like, you don't want to be especially risk-oriented or aggressive in your play as an anchor role, because, say, you can give that side up. If you give up, say, like, side where you're anchoring, by taking a risk, that can almost automatically lose the round, right? But the final topic I want to get into before Sam has to go is Taco, because I think I've seen it both ways online. Is some people, like, you know, love Taco, they'll defend him to death, great anchor, smart player, etc., etc. And then other people see, going back to my original contrarian dilemma, those 5 kills on the scoreboard, be like, this guy's gotta fucking go. And in my own research, I was watching all those Nuke liquid Astralis liquid games on Nuke. There is just like one round a game where like Astralis rolls into a ramp room, Taco holds like the spray just like a bullet or two too long, he gets headshot, Astralis get the lower sight, leads to a free round, and it's just like, that's just not the way. That's just like not a good play. You just fucked it up, either by not hitting the shot or by holding too long, right? And I have a hard time when it comes to Taco. It's like, how, like, if you brought in a better player like Automatic, would that be a better team? If you brought in Fugly from NRG, would that be a better team? Actually, I think Fugly has his issues on NRG and has had some pretty bad games recently. But what do you think about Taco as a player? Is that a player that you would take the risk of doing what you're saying, of trying to mold a better player into his roles if he had the right mentality? Or do you think that he has...
I mean, I would say Taco has significantly improved the last few events for Team Liquid. I think I was in the same mindset as you, like the first few events he played with Liquid, and like even, you know, looking at like the Major, Need League Premier, and things kind of early in the year for Liquid, I think you could have easily made the case, because it comes down to that point I made way earlier about like there is a minimum threshold you must meet before you become a burden on your team. And there were certainly some games where like Taco was not hitting that threshold, that he was becoming actually a pretty huge burden on his team in certain games. But I think that he has somewhat rounded the corner in more recent events, and so I kind of want to see how that plays out. But I think that you still could make the argument of getting a player, like you mentioned, like an Automatic or something, who maybe is willing to have the mentality to play more supportive and is going to be a little bit more skilled, that maybe they are going to be able to produce more frags in certain positions that Taco was playing that he couldn't get, and then therefore maybe that would make the team overall better. I think you could make that argument, sure. I don't know. I mean, the thing is with Taco, personally, some of it I think has been over romanticized.
Yeah,
like, it triggered me to no end whenever people are like, he's the magic thing that makes Cold Zero work. Get the fuck out of my face! Like,
oh, that was really dumb.
That was so dumb. Like, they didn't even play on the same side of the map half the time on T side. Yeah. So like, I don't know how Taco was helping Cold from the opposite end of the map. You know, like there were certain CT sites that they played together, and you could make arguments that Taco would kind of help set up Cold in certain spots, like Beyond Mirage, since we keep talking about that so much. Like that's something you could point at. But
AZ helps Valde. We don't say that Valde is nothing without AZ.
So I mean, there's some truth to it, but it definitely got over romanticized. But on the other hand, like Taco definitely has value. Like I've definitely seen him have good games. I've definitely seen him do good things for his teammates. He is one of those guys that will kind of play whatever spot is needed to facilitate the other players on his team. You know, I think it's weird, like at times he was labeled like an entry fragger, but he would play the edge of the map and he wasn't really entering all the time. He wasn't like the classic entry. The Fur was more of that for the team, obviously. So I don't know. I feel like Taco's like a weird character that has been defined many different ways across the different teams he's played on. Like I've heard him be called a support. I've heard him be called an entry fragger. There's times where he opts now. So like,
I feel like Taco with the op is just like pure desperation. It's like, who will give the op to? Somebody.
I think he's fine.
I think he's
I don't think he's fine. I think he's below average to add.
No, I think that Taco is a player that's been often spoken of and seldom actually watched.
Yeah.
I think when people watch SK or watch Luminosity, you're not watching Taco. You're watching some of the greatest players in the game. You're not watching Taco. So I think people talk about him without watching him. But when you do watch him, you might get varying opinions. He is a polarizing player because he has significant lapses in like aim. But at the same time, like I actually think Taco is a pretty smart player. Yep. So like when I look at him in game, I think he has a lot of value. I think he makes good decisions. I think that his individual level is, I wouldn't say outright bad. I would say varying. It's weird. He's not a consistent player individually at all. Like Taco could perform better significantly individually than he does now if he was a better individual player. Like I don't think he's in a role where he's doomed to have terrible stats, and he doesn't have terrible stats right now. But I definitely think that it's feasible for him to have like a 1.08 instead of a 1.0. Like I think that's the realm of possibilities for him. But at the same time, I think he's a pretty smart player. I don't think he's especially not on Team Liquid. I don't think he's a problem. His individual level is a problem because Nitro is a pretty good fragger, and because you have a great 3 stars. When I look at games that Liquid plays, I don't look at it as this team just needs more firepower. Like that's not the way that I look at the team, at least myself. And I would be weary of changing him, because if you look at how much they improved when he came in compared to Steel, who is fulfilling similar functions in the game, I think that there's something about Taco. I don't know if it's his attitude or the fact that he's from a legendary team, and so people feel more confident when they're playing with him, or something that goes on. But there's definitely Liquid significantly improved, even though individually they didn't improve when Taco joined Team Liquid. And so if you added Tim, I would say Tim he can definitely play supportive positions, and he doesn't seem at all like a cocky guy. But at the same time, Tim is a big downer. Like
I saw the interview with Doran, the Reflections interview. He's like furious at nothing he like gave up hope on nothing after he like didn't wait for him after like he went to the bathroom and nothing didn't wait for him outside. It was the most bizarre story.
But I don't mean he's toxic, but like what I mean is
I get what you're saying.
He's just kind of a mopey. He's kind of a mopey guy. He seems like a nice guy to talk to, but he's definitely low energy and all that. While Taco is more of a spirited guy, and I look at the rest of Team Liquid, I'm like, there's a lot of guys that are low energy there. You look at NAF, and you look at Elite, and you're like, please, not another one of those. Yeah. So I think that temperamentally, it would be dangerous to add Tim to that team because it might mess up with the team dynamics. I think it helps to have Taco there. It helps to have Zeus there, to sort of like give color to them, because even like Twist is colored, but Twist is also really angsty right now because he's so young. At least that's the vibe that I get from his Twitter and his interviews and things like that. He takes it very hard on himself when he loses or when it does poorly, which is great for a superstar, but also is going to depress the hell out of your team. So I think Taco is a perfect fit for Team Liquid. But like, I don't think he should go back to MIBR. So that's kind of my.
I don't know. I think like Taco's interesting because I think he is a flexible player, because there were times where he was kind of used at entry for certain executes for his previous teams, and how he's kind of being used now. I think he often plays peripheral. I think he's a peripheral player. I think it's fair to call him that. Maybe like on Mirage is like the exception. He kind of plays a little bit more towards middle, a little bit more actively involved in like actually opening up space. But I think that what's good about Taco is, one, he does have that mentality of like being willing to do whatever it takes to help his team win, which a lot of players are not as selfless as he is when it comes to mentality. So I think he's important for that reason. I think he is flexible enough with his skill set to kind of at times just hold a spot and like just relay information and cut off rotates. But because like with you were saying a little bit earlier about like his intelligence, dude, he does seem to have this uncanny ability to like know when he can kind of solo push something and like get a kill and cause a problem.
Yes, exactly.
Like, when he plays B tunnels on DusT 2 on T side, like he just seems to have this uncanny intuition on like when he can like peek into the B bomb site and like kind of backstab someone and kill them in the side of the head. So like I would say that he definitely has that ability, like even if his numbers aren't amazing, to like still have these little pieces of impact that will still spiral and help his team out. So I don't know, like I definitely think I can't know how good his communication is. I can't know what his morale is like for the team. I would imagine it's upbeat. I can't know how much he helps with calling. So these are all things I can't judge. Maybe he's really good in those areas and that's how he helps the team as well. But I would just say that his willingness to play spots maybe other people don't want to play, the fact that he can at times have impact in those positions, but also at other times take a back seat, I think is like perfect for what Liquid needs him for. Given that the fact that they already have a bunch of people who want to make plays like Naf, like Twist. Yep. When Nitro's not opping, he'll do it on T side too with an AK. You got Elish, who's classically more of an entry type player. So I think he does balance them out in that way, that he's willing to take a back seat when he needs to.
Yeah, it's so difficult because there's just like two aspects of him where you just like will have those moments like, God damn, like that's pathetic.
Yeah.
Like you have to be able to do that. Like you can't just like throw away around like that. Well, there's so many other qualities about him that are like helpful, that are obviously useful. He has a lot of in-game intelligence, and it's really hard. I feel like he's sort of almost the crucible of the support player. Like he's like an exaggerated version of a support player where he has those rounds where you look at it and it's like, this, if we just replace this guy with a better fragger, we'll be so much better off. But then he also has those rounds on the other side where he brings so much to the team just by just pressing W and walking forward and checking spots, getting information. He just has that knowledge, that capacity. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a good spot to end it. Taco is support player. If you love taco, you like cilantro, maybe a little tomato, a little corn, and support players. Okay.